All right, we made it. We are in our last official lecture topic of the semester before the final. It's been a long road, but we're here. Thank you for joining me in part one and two of this video over the New Right, chapter 28. In our last video, we discussed Jimmy Carter's presidency, which was largely marked by a economic crisis, stagflation, which is the stagnating economy mixed in with inflation. You also have deindustrialization in the Rust Belt happening, and issues of the Cold War and other international issues such as the Iranian hostage crisis taking place as well during this time. Now, despite Carter's humanitarian efforts for the U.S. to cooperate with the Soviet Union and not to start dictators around the world, Carter also did things like he gave back the Panama Canal to the Panamanians, uh, and also, so despite all of Carter's humanitarian efforts, he eventually lost out. He lost the support of the people. Um, and he addressed the American public to address that the American people had lost faith in the presidency, which helped to spark the this major turning point in U.S. history with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So Reagan brought forth dramatic change in American politics with massive support of the new right. Um, so, so today's essay question for the final is: how did the new right develop between the 1960s and 1980s? Which groups supported the new right and why? So breaking down that, just talk about how this new right, this new swing in American politics to conservatism really happened in this period between 1960 and 1980, and what kind of groups supported this movement, which we will all get into in this lecture. So Reagan, he really sparked this major change in U.S. history. He brought forth a dramatic change in American politics and brought about massive support for the new right. Reagan's economic, social, and international policies attracted Americans from all across from many political lines who are searching for hope and change and getting out of the very difficult decade of the 70s. And remember that the 70s was a very difficult decade for many Americans. So Reagan was a opportunity many Americans saw to make a difference. If we elect Reagan into the presidency, America will change, and for good or bad, it did. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to discuss the triumph of the right and how the conservative republicanism dominated the 1980s and impacted American history. All right, so let's discuss this transition in the Republican Party and the origin of the new right. So remember that during World War II, and that that the president at the time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he was a Democrat, right? So during World War II, we really see, and the Great Depression, we see an increase in big government. We see the government getting more and more involved in politics and over the nation. Um, and remember that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, for that matter, looked very different in the beginning of the 20th century. Remember that in the South, the majority of the political party in the South was Democrats, right? Primarily white Southern Democrats, while the North was largely Republican. We're going to talk about this switch, how in modern American politics, it's the complete opposite. The South is dominated by the Republican political party, and the North primarily is dominated by the Democratic Party. So we'll talk about the switch there, but also the switch in political ideologies of both of these parties during this time. And it really took place between this 1960s and 1980s period. Um, and even when Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, was in office, he did a lot to promote, you know, the government, social welfare programs, and he promoted détente, which is this cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, which, as we'll see, Republicans in the 80s uh, did the complete opposite. They did not support big government. They continued this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, um, and you see a complete switch that's happening there. Um, so, how did this transition happen? So while uh, while the Democratic president before Nixon, Johnson, who was a staunch, we see him, Johnson was a staunch anti-communist, but he was a Democrat, right? So again, you see um, this change in what we see Republicans and Democrats being in the early, and by the mid 1960s. So the modern understanding of political parties between Republicans and Democrats were not the same in the 1960s as they are today. In many of these cases, the stances are actually flipped. So let's discuss how this new right came about. Um, and really, race helped to drive the creation of the new right. The Civil Rights Movement, along with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, challenge the racial hierarchy in the Jim Crow South. And remember that all these things occurred, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Movement, under Democratic leadership with John F. Kennedy and then also Johnson after Kennedy was assassinated. So this was all under Democratic leadership. And remember that the majority of Democrats during this time were, in fact, white Southerners, and many of them wanted to uphold this racial hierarchy in the South. So once they see their political candidates doing all these things for civil rights, many of these people are like, okay, well, obviously the Democratic Party doesn't support our values anymore, and we need to shift our political stances, our political parties. So because of this, because of race and the Civil Rights Act, many Southern white Democrats, in fact, changed their political stance from Democratic to Republican during this time. Also, in the late 60s and early 70s, the Black Power movement, affirmative action, uh, and all these riots, race riots taking place across the nation, which we've discussed in previous videos, um, uh, signals social chaos, right? That, oh, the Democrats are allowing all this to happen while in office, so we no longer support the Democratic Party. Um, so at the same time, slowing wage growth, rising prices, growing taxes burden many working and middle class citizens, um, and liberalism no longer seemed to offer the white Americans this roadmap to prosperity that once did. Right, that in the beginning of the 20th century, we see this major shift to Democrats and liberalism, but by this 1960s, 1970 time period, many people started to lose faith in the Democratic Party and then switch over to the Republican Party. Um, so between 1968 and 1972, um, there was this former Alabama governor, George Wallace. He was a conservative Democrat, so he was part of the Democratic Party. George Wallace masterfully exploited racial, cultural, and economic resentments for the working class whites throughout the South and into his presidential election. Remember when we talked about the civil rights movement, we did mention George Wallace, how he was the governor of Alabama. He was very pro segregation during the 1960s. Um, And remember that he was famously quoted by saying, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." Remember, this is a guy who ran for president in the 80s. So I'm sorry, during the 70s. So Wallace, in 1972, he ran as a Democrat, and he was gaining popularity across the industrial heartland of America, like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Indiana as well, but mainly across the South. So he was gaining a lot of steam in 1972. But in May of that year, there was a assassination attempt on George Wallace's life, and he was shot in the spine and eventually paralyzed, which ended his presidential campaign. Nevertheless, his whole campaign was centered around this idea that uh, that pol- eh, that he believed politics needed to change, that there needed to be a new conservative movement in the United States. So George Wallace did a huge thing for American politics in that he shifted American politics primarily in the South and into the new right, the new conservative right. Um, so Wallace fell out of the race, but Richard Nixon, he ran for president that year too, and he similarly harshened the new right's sense of grievance through his rhetoric about law and order. And remember that Nixon himself was a Republican, right? So he again tapped into this growing resentment, growing frustration in American politics of the sense that we need to get back to law and order. So Nixon ran, um, and and he became president, right? So this is a Nixon was a conservative president who gained the office in the 70s. Um, and he upheld many of the conservative values besides the whole, get along with the Soviets thing. But then, after Nixon was kicked out of office after Watergate, Gerald Ford continued to accommodate politics for um, the new this New Deal, and the new right remained without a public champion. Right, so they felt that the Republican leadership that was in office didn't really uphold the new right. So also in the 1960s and 70s, there was a huge sense amongst many evangelical and conservative Christians that they were being alienated from politics by the liberal Democratic Party. For example, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court, like we mentioned last week, they passed Roe versus Wade. But also in the 60s, the Supreme Court passed some other court cases like Engel versus Vital, which restricted Bible reading in schools. Um, and then there was another court case that led uh, that said that um, separated the church, religious teachings from public schools and public education, which was a huge deal because for many evangelical Christians at this time, because they felt like, oh, the government's trying to take Christianity out of public schools, and we need to have a political party that would represent us, that would say, hey, religion does need to be in schools. So, as we mentioned in our previous video, that during these years there was a huge counterculture celebration of like sex and drugs, primarily in the 60s, and going into the 70s, and along with relaxed obscenity and pornography laws, and also this intensified this idea that the Democratic Party uh, did not represent the values of conservative Christians. So evangelical Protestants and Christians profess their personal relationship with Jesus Christ and upheld the Bible as an infallible source for truth, felt that it was a duty to convert or evangelize non believers and move them over to this new right. right? So that we have this growing religious movement that's becoming very political and aligning itself with this new conservative new right that was taking place at the time. Um, so we see this major shift into the new right, which was represented by former white Democrats in the South, along with evangelical Protestant Christians who both felt like they were being alienated from the liberal politics taking place in the 1960s and 1970s. Um, with increasing with this sort of sentiment increasing in the 60s and 70s, there was also many of these people, many of these evangelical Christians at this time felt like that the traditional American family was under siege as well. And many women became a core part of this religious right and became really the foot soldiers of the new religious right movement taking place at this time. And then in 1968 and 1969, a new group of political politicized mothers in Anaheim, California, led a sustained protest against sex education in public schools. Um, and as we mentioned in our previous videos, that the activist Phyllis Schlafly marshaled the opposition for the ERA movement, um, and also which was that equal rights amendment, right? So Phyllis Schlafly, a major activist at this time, saying that by granting women equal rights in the United States, we are actually hurting their privileges. So Phyllis Schlafly, who was a Catholic herself, went along with this ideology of the new right. Also, remember that in our previous video, we discussed Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, which allowed women to have the right to have an abortion, choose what they want to do with their bodies in the United States. This ruling outraged devout Catholics and evangelicals across the country. Catholics in particular remain staunchly against abortion, even more so than evangelical Christians. Catholics believe that abortion is a mortal sin, and they have fought since the 70s to repeal this Roe v. Wade. Now, in recent years, this has obviously died down and stuff, but at the time, with activists like the Catholic Phyllis Schlafly, there were many Catholic and evangelical Christian organizations that took place to oppose the uh, and to oppose abortion. So, so one of my former professors in graduate school, Dr. Daniel Williams over at the University of West Georgia, he's a religious historian, and he wrote a book about the perplexities of Catholics and politics in recent history. And in his book, he argues that Catholics should be, on paper, aligned with the modern liberal party. Uh, but a core part of Catholic doctrine is, for example, the core part of Catholic doctrine is social welfare programs, feeding and providing shelter to the poor, healthcare, and charity, which are all aligned with liberal politics, right? The modern Democratic Party. However, in the 70s, we see this major rift amongst many Catholics in the United States who believe that abortion is, in fact, a mortal sin, and they cannot support a liberal party that also supports abortion. So this is what caused many Catholics, such as Phyllis Schlafly, but other conservative Catholics, to move towards the new right at this time, because this issue over abortion, despite all the other things that Catholics believe in, such as health care, giving to the poor, and social welfare programs, which are all, and civil rights too, which are all championed by the Liberal Party. But we see this major rift in politics, especially in religious politics, between um, Republicans and Democrats. So he goes on to argue that many Catholics today feel politically divided and alienated because they support these liberal social welfare programs, but they do not support abortion. So we see this big divide in modern politics that goes back to this 1970s period. So religion is a huge factor of what's going on at this time, and this new support for the right. We have this religious right movement taking place as well. Um, Also, grassroots passion drove anti-abortion activism, um, and set religious and secular institutions into this new support for the new right. um, and then in 1979, there's this guy, Jerry Farwell. He was a Baptist minister and a religious broadcaster from Lynchburg, Virginia. He founded the Moral Majority, as he called it, an explicitly political organization dedicated to the pro life, pro family, and pro morality, and and it was also pro-American, right? So that's what this moral majority was. It was pro-life, pro-family, pro morality, and pro-American, and it centered itself in the new right. Um, the moral majority skillfully wove together social and economic appeals to make itself a force in Republican politics. So this guy Jerry Farwell, he was a big proponent of this. He was a huge televangelist preacher, and he reached out to millions of Americans, right? 2 to 3 million registered as a moral majority voter in the first 2 years alone. So Jerry Farwell was also one of these major people who pushed the religious right into the Republican Party. Um, so uh, this was a big reason why by the 1980s Christians gravitated towards the Republican Party, now focused on the goals of the new right. So we see this shift in the Republican Party taking place because of all these social movements taking place at this time. A transformation of what the Republican Party looked like in the 60s versus what it looked like going into the 80s. All right. So another major reason why there was a shift to the new right was because the Cold War. Oh, this is another picture of Jerry Farwell too. Um, so another reason why there was a big shift to the new right was the Cold War throughout the 70s. Even though Nixon was a Republican, one of his major policies during his presidency was this policy of détente, which was which meant that the U.S. would cooperate with the Soviet Union to ease tensions during the Cold War. However, in the 1970s, many Cold Warriors, as they were called in America, really opposed communism and thought that the U.S. shouldn't have anything to do with the Soviet Union or China. They believed that détente would just make the U.S. vulnerable for the Soviets. So during the 70s, we see this big shift to the right from many different groups across the country. We have white Southern Democrats, Protestant Catholic conservative groups, and these Cold Warriors who believed that neither party was doing enough to oppose the communists during the Cold War. And this brings us to Jimmy Carter. Oh, Jimmy. So Jimmy Carter was a Democrat with nice ideas about humanitarianism, but as we mentioned in our last class, he was elected as president largely because the American people did not trust Ford after he pardoned Nixon after the whole Watergate scandal. So Carter entered the presidency, and he was elected despite his liberal political beliefs. As a response to the people who did not trust the Republican Party under Ford, um, and after Watergate. So Carter was a Democrat in office, and as we mentioned last week, the Carter administration had to deal with a lot of stuff, including unemployment, stagflation, the Iranian hostage crisis, and all of this drastically hurt Carter's presidency. Carter also had to deal with the decline of the American auto industry, which further impacted the economy, which in turn hurt his popularity. So also at the world in the having in the world at this time, we'll get more into this on Wednesday. Um, but the Soviet Union also invaded Afghanistan, um, going into the presidency too. And Carter's initial response to this, really hurt his political campaign. Also, so we see this is where we're going to leave off in part one of this video. This uh, Throughout the 1960s and 70s, we see a shift in American politics to the new right, and we have many groups of Americans who are dissatisfied in how the country was going, who lost faith in both political parties, and this growing belief that Americans needed to get back to conservative values anchored in religion. So in our next video, we will discuss the election of Ronald Reagan, this turning point of the new right, this rise of the new right that took place once Reagan entered the office. So please go and watch part two of this video where we talk about Ronald Reagan and his early presidency, and his domestic policies too. So thank you for your attention, and please tune in to part two of this video as well. Thank you.